Hey, what's up guys? In this video, we're going to take a behind the scenes look to see exactly how all of the latest and greatest countermeasures were professionally installed in my car. Now, in a previous video, I've shown you guys the end result with everything completed and finished. Now, I was at the shop for most of this install watching the professional installers, and I learned a lot of really cool tips and tricks that I'd like to share with you. Some of them are about the specifics of the different radar detectors and laser jammers that can make it easier or harder to get them installed in your vehicle. I saw a bunch of tips of how they can protect your car when they're doing the install, different tricks to make the install itself easier, or even things that they can do to make future servicing in your vehicle simpler as well. Now, this install was done by Systems Unlimited in Bellevue, Washington. They're a high-end shop that I've used in the past for a previous upgrade, and I used them again this time around, and yet again, I've been very happy with the results that they produced. Now, one of the coolest parts though, and things that you won't necessarily realize if you just drop your car off at a shop and get it back, is how much care and attention to detail goes into everything behind the scenes, which is really what I want to show you guys here. And so with that said, let's take a look at some of the coolest tips and tricks that I learned by watching these professional installers at work. Now, there's going to be a lot of equipment that's going to be installed here in this car. In fact, I've done a previous video that's going over all the new equipment and specifically what the upgrades and improvements are compared to the previous generations of this hardware. And so if you'd like to learn more about the specifics of the different radar detectors and laser jammers and dash cams themselves, definitely take a look at the previous video that I did. And then we're also going to be doing some testing with the different radar detectors. There's going to be comparisons and reviews and tutorials for all this kind of equipment. So make sure you're subscribed to get notified for new videos when they go live as well. And if you'd like to learn more about any of the equipment that I show you, or if you'd like to purchase them yourself, down in the video description, I'm going to be linking you guys to all the equipment that I've got installed here in my car. Now, diving into the install, after I met up with the guys several times to kind of go over the game plan for what we're going to be installing and how it should go into the car, when it was time for the install, brought it into the shop and we started pulling off all the different bumpers and body panels. There were a lot of cables to release and disconnect, and they spent a fair amount of time actually protecting the car, including wrapping the edges of the headlights or the edges of the body panels with tape. That way the edges don't get chipped or damaged during the install. Same thing with putting protective tape along the dash. That way when they pull back the A-pillar, the fabric on the A-pillar cover doesn't get damaged either. Of course, they had a bunch of special tools for this as well. For example, removing the A-pillar I found to be pretty tricky on my car. And so they went over exactly how the clip works to release the A-pillar and the tool that you can use to reach back behind the airbag and release that clip. And then for all of the equipment that was going to be installed in the car, I noticed there was a lot of customization, there was a lot of thought and attention to detail with exactly how they installed each piece of hardware. So let's go ahead and start running through all the different equipment, starting first with the Uniden R9. Now, in the back of the car is where I had all the previous CPUs installed, and unfortunately because it was so full, we didn't have room to install the R9 CPU back there as well. And so for this system, we actually wound up taking the CPU and installing it up in the dash, kind of behind the steering wheel area. And installing it up at the front of the car wound up speeding up the install, and it made things easier with the wiring, especially because we didn't have to extend the wires and run them all the way to the back of the vehicle. Now, both the CPU and the speaker were installed on brackets back behind the dash. They custom built brackets for all this different hardware so it could be securely installed back there. And because it's installed back behind the steering column, safety was really important, so they really made sure that there were no cables or hardware or anything that could get potentially wrapped around the steering column as I'm driving and obviously become an issue as I'm driving down the road. And then to power the system, we actually tapped into some expansion wires that we'd installed last time, and that was especially helpful because none of the fuses up at the front of the car are actually ignition triggered and turn on and off with the car, so that was a nice upgrade from the past that we took advantage of. And to make it even better, they added these special bullet connectors that can easily connect and disconnect, and then they crimped them onto those connectors as well, so that if I want to connect some additional stuff there, again, it makes it a lot easier for me to just plug something directly in and unplug it as needed, just for kind of like more temporary testing. And then for the radar detector antenna that goes up front, they installed that right alongside all of the other front-facing radar detectors, and then of course they aligned it to ensure that the radar detector's antenna had nice, clear line of sight out of my grille. The rear radar detector was installed back behind the rear bumper, again, right alongside the other rear antennas. The laser jammers were installed up the front of the car and added to the cluster with most of the other laser jammers. And I'll share more about how these housings were built a little bit later in the video. The laser distribution box was installed in the engine bay, right alongside the new Escort laser bridge box. The GPS antenna we tried to fit in the spoiler, which is where all the other GPS antennas went, but everything was pretty full at that point. We weren't able to put it in, and so instead we wound up installing the GPS antenna up behind the front bumper. And then to update the R9, I've got a USB update panel in the back of the car for all the different systems, but that panel is now full. And so this time around, we installed the cable up at the front of the car, accessible behind a hidden panel. And they even wound up attaching a magnet to that USB update cable so that I can attach it to my car and ensure that it stays secure and not rattle and vibrate annoyingly quickly as I'm driving down the road. Now, what was interesting is that plate inside the car wasn't actually sufficiently magnetic or metallic for the magnet to stick to. And so what they did was, after they attached the magnet to the USB cable, they actually had this special magnetic paper that they could attach it to, and they cut out a bit of that paper and stuck it to my car so that the cable could actually securely stick to my car. And then once everything was ready, they shrink wrapped everything and even printed R9 on the shrink wrap itself to make it extra clear exactly what that USB cable is for. And then for the external LED, we wanted to install it in that custom housing that I've got at the front of the car for the ALP and Escort systems. And so we popped it off my dash and they started taking a look inside. Now the issue was there's several layers of acrylic that are glued together, and they wanted to actually drill into it to create a third hole for the Uniden LED, but the risk was if they got it wrong, it could actually crack and destroy the whole thing and they'd have to rebuild the whole thing from scratch. But luckily they picked up a new drill bit, they were carefully able to drill it in there, and then once all was said and done, they were able to get the LED in there. So now I've got LEDs for 3 different systems right up there, and then they just resecured it back onto my dash. Next, they built a custom housing for both the controller and for the display. Now this housing was first designed in CAD, and they even printed the word Vortex on the housing, which I thought was a nice touch. Furthermore, they also matched the angle of the housing itself with the other angles of the car. That way it looks that much better aesthetically. And it definitely blends better than what I tried in my car temporarily for testing, where I just attached both of them to the dash using double stick tape. Additionally, they also created some quick release cables behind both the controller and the display, making any future service easier. Then they wrapped everything in tape, again to avoid any sort of rattles inside the car. Speaking of which, for the rear radar detector antenna, that one has an extension cable that has to run all the way back up to the front of the car, and they left the quick release connectors for that in the bumper, again to make future servicing easier. Similarly, for the extension cables up at the front of the car, they actually shortened those cables. That way you don't have a bunch of excess cable all bundled up and just kind of like shoved and stuffed behind body panels. And so as you can see, there's a lot of work that goes into here, well beyond just kind of like attaching something to a bracket and screwing it to the car, or like sticking something to the interior with double stick tape. There's a lot of additional customization that's gone into this install. Next, let's take a look at the installation of the Escort Redline Ci 360C. Now this was an upgrade over the previous gen Max Ci 360, and I really appreciated that Escort made so much of the connectors and components reusable when you're upgrading to the Redline. It, again, made the upgrade process that much easier. In fact, most of the cables we were able to reuse. We were able to reuse the cables for the radar detectors, the power cables, the GPS, as well as even the controller and the display. Obviously though, there were still some things that we needed to upgrade. For example, we had to swap out the radar detector antennas, the CPU, and then of course all of the different laser hardware, including a bunch of the cables. Now the CPU upgrade itself is pretty straightforward. It's basically the same idea. The new one adds Wi-Fi capabilities. And one of the additional upgrades that they added is, again, these quick release connectors for the power cable. They use the same kind of bullet connectors as before, and that's especially helpful because the power cable is actually soldered to the CPU, and if down the line I needed to maybe upgrade the system or send it out for repair or something, or replacement, I now have a quick release cable that makes it much easier to get the system out of the car and then put it back in later as needed. Additionally, to make the connections inside of those bullet connectors that much stronger, they first soldered all the wiring together before crimping those connectors into place. Next, moving on to the radar detectors, this part was fairly straightforward to upgrade. You just kind of like unplug the old ones, put the new ones in place, redo your brackets as needed. The newer Redline Ci's front radar detector is definitely smaller than the older Max Ci's detector. And then for the rear radar detector antenna, same thing, they just upgraded that one with the newer antenna. Furthermore, the quick release connector used to be installed inside the car, and so they then brought it out in the car and then put it back into the bumper area, again for easier access for servicing if needed in the future. Plus, that also helps us avoid having to like cut holes inside the car and then reseal them afterwards if we're having to run new cables. Then for the laser side, this was probably one of the most complex parts of the upgrade, in part because it's all new hardware, all new cabling, and we still wanted to reuse some of the existing hardware, the existing cabling, even though it wasn't originally designed for that. You see, as I mentioned, the CPUs all go in the back of the car, and we really wanted to avoid having to run all new wires inside the car and underneath panels and whatnot, so we were really wanting to continue using the existing extension wire that ran from the front to the back of the car. Now, unfortunately, the connectors for those cables are different between the Max Ci and the Redline Ci. However, it turns out both of the cables still have 6 wires inside. And so what they wound up doing is actually cutting off the connector on the older bridge box and attaching that to the existing extension cable that runs to the back of the car, and then they had the 6 wires exposed that they could interact with. And then they wound up cutting one of the extra extension cables for the newer Redline Ci that has the newer connector. Then they looked at the pinouts for all the different connectors to see how all the internal wires were run. And then it does turn out that the Misc CI and Redline CI do use different color wires internally, but once they verified that everything was electrically connected properly, they went ahead and soldered all the wires together, they wrapped everything in heat shrink and closed everything up, and then tucked all of this custom wiring away. And so it was pretty impressive to see that even though it wasn't originally designed to work, they're able to actually go in and figure out exactly how the wires are connected so that they could still make it work regardless. And in testing, yeah, everything worked out great. Now, something that we noticed with the Escort laser jammers are that the wires that run out of the back of the heads are actually really long, longer than what we see with other laser jammers. Nevertheless, they ran the wires with the quick disconnects right alongside the factory quick disconnects. You see, with most of the different laser jammers, they can run all the quick disconnects into the bumper area, actually really close to where the factory quick releases are. And the idea is, in case maybe you need future service in your car or something, if a technician winds up pulling your bumper, they can see where the factory disconnects are, and they see the other laser jamming equipment as well right next to it that's labeled, and they can realize like, oh, this all needs to be pulled apart too. With the Escort heads, because those cables are really long, they have to go all the way into the car to the laser bridge box that's installed in the engine bay. And so for that reason, you can't get the same quick release connectors in the bumper area the way you can with the other laser jamming systems. Then as for the laser jammer heads themselves, I really like the fact that they're so small and compact, smaller than most of the other laser jammers, with the exception of maybe the Stingers. Now, what I like about these smaller heads is that number one, they're going to open up some additional possibilities for placement options in your car. They can fit in smaller locations within your grille, which can potentially open up additional possibilities depending on the size of the openings in the grille. Additionally, once you've got everything installed, they're going to be that much more stealth and hidden and harder to see and better looking aesthetically than maybe another system that has physically larger heads. This new Escort system also now uses two different types of heads, just like your ALPs and TMGs and most of the competition. And if you take a look at the laser bridge box, you can see where the different types of heads plug in. The regular heads are going to be your transceivers. They both transmit and receive, hence the name transceiver. And then your TX head that goes in the center, or your transmit head, those are going to plug into the transmit ports. The cables and connectors are different, so you can't plug them into the wrong port, but it is easy to wind up actually putting the heads into the wrong port if you're not careful. We actually did wind up running into that issue, and so I wound up having to go back to the installer and get the heads swapped out, which ultimately wasn't a big deal, in part because of the fact that with the Escort heads, all the heads for both head types are actually the same exact size. And so if you wind up having to like uninstall a head and put another one in its place, because the heads are all the same size, you don't have to wind up rebuilding any of the housings and the holders. You can use all of the same exact mounting hardware. So that actually winds up being a nice benefit of having different head types all have the same physical size. Next, let's take a look at the Stinger system. Now with the Stinger, we wound up having to replace just about everything, including basically all of the wiring. Now we were originally planning on taking the new CPU and putting it in the back of the car right where the old CPU used to be. However, Stinger was concerned about us extending the wires, and so for that reason they really wanted us to install the CPU up at the front of the car. And so we wound up installing the CPU up at the front of the car right by the Uniden R9 CPU behind the dash. And because the CPU moved from the back to the front, then, well, we wound up having to redo all the wiring as well. Now, starting off first with the radar detector antenna, we installed it in the same location where the previous flat patch antenna used to be. To mount the antenna, we just used the factory bracket to install this new S850 antenna, again, right where the old HD antenna used to be. And then one thing I like about the omnipolarized antenna is the fact that the antenna can actually be rotated. Now, of course, it still has to be pointed straight ahead, but unlike most other radar detectors that have to be installed horizontally, with this one you could actually rotate it 90 degrees and install it vertically if you prefer, in case that winds up fitting better in the car. Then when it comes to the laser jammers, the Stinger has these tiny fiber optic jammers, which really helps to open up a lot of possibilities as far as exactly where those heads could be installed in the car. And we spent a lot of time kind of going over options with Stinger, talking with my installer, taking a look at exactly what was behind the bumper, etc. Now, we considered installing the laser jammers in the same laser jamming cluster as all the other heads, but we wound up not doing that for a couple of reasons. Number one, Stinger wanted the outer heads actually closer to the different headlights. Number two, for the center heads, they were kind of concerned about reflections behind the acrylic covers that I've got there. And number three, well, I kind of wanted to take advantage of the fact that we had these smaller heads, and I was curious to see what kind of possibilities would be available with smaller heads like this. Now, for the center heads, they wound up drilling two holes right in the grille itself, and then installing the transmit and receive heads directly in the grille right underneath all of the other laser jammers installed behind the smoked acrylic. And then for the outer heads, we considered putting them in the grille itself right next to the headlights, but it turns out behind the grille there was a lot of plastic that would get in the way of the install. We considered putting the heads in the panel gap right between the headlight and the bumper, but it turns out the tolerances there were too tight. There wasn't enough space to put them in there. And so we were then looking at two different options. One was to actually drill into the bumper itself underneath the headlights, and then the second option was to install them in these removable panels under the headlights, which I think are used for maybe higher trim versions of my car that have like headlight washers or something, but on my car there's nothing installed back there. We ultimately installed to use those removable panels so that in case in the future if I want to uninstall the system, I don't wind up having holes in my bumper itself. I can just replace those little panel covers instead. And then to physically hold the laser jammer heads, they built some special boxes that go behind those removable panels, and those are there to make sure the heads are pointed nice and straight with a slight up tilt the way that Stinger recommends. And then remember how I mentioned with the Escort they had really long cables? With the Stinger we had kind of the opposite issue with actually really short cables. Specifically the part of the head that connects between the fiber optic head itself and then a little box back behind there, which is like the brains of each of the individual heads. That particular length of cable was actually pretty short, and the installers actually wound up finding that it kind of limits your options where like your head is here, but you can only put the box in certain limited places because that run of cable is so short. So one of the pieces of feedback that they had for Stinger was maybe making that length of cable a little bit longer just to give them additional placement options inside the vehicle. And then the other end of those cables, those can still come together. Now, something that was pretty interesting here is when you're actually connecting the Stinger laser jammer heads, it's a little bit different from a lot of other laser jammers because you're not assigning them to any specific ports. Like, you're not actually really concerned with which ones are the outer heads or which ones are the center heads. You're not even like pairing your transmitter and receiver. You're not like plugging these two in together and then these two transmitter and receivers get paired together. If you look at the CPU itself, you'll see that everything comes together in one transmit port and one receive port. And then you've got different ports for the front, rear, or even sides of the vehicle. But either way, it was kind of surprising to me to not see like center transmit heads the way you have with a lot of the other systems, and the fact that you're not really concerned with like pairing the two different transmitter and receiver pairs. The GPS antenna was up in the rear spoiler of the car, but we wound up having to run the cable back up to the front of the vehicle now. The display holder had to be modified as well. The newer versions of the CPU uses a mini HDMI connector, and because we were initially planning on reusing the hardware, I bought this adapter that converts full-size HDMI to mini HDMI, but we wound up not using that. Instead, we wound up having to pull the whole dash off and replacing the display holder itself. Then we ran the cable up to the CPU behind the dash, but the display holder itself, we did have to notch out the back a bit to allow the cable to actually run out the back of the display holder. Finally, for all of the remaining cables that are still in the back of the car, we just wound up capping those off, tying them up, and then stuffing them away out of sight. And so the Stinger install was definitely more involved, but they got it done. Next, we've got the Radenso RC M. Now, I was initially planning on actually removing the system out of the car. I feel like the RCM's a little bit out of date at this point compared to the competition, but it actually just wound up being easier to leave it in. That way we didn't have to like rebuild the whole display and controller housing up at the front of the car. Now, one thing that we did notice though was an issue with one of the radar detector antenna cables. We noticed that you could spin the locking mechanism, but it was actually broken and could allow the cables to start getting loose or even disconnect. And obviously this could lead to a whole variety of issues in practice, and so they wound up taking care of that issue as well. Then when it comes to the AntiLaser Priority, this had a number of different upgrades. We wanted to upgrade to the new Hardware 6 CPU. We upgraded all the regular heads in the car, and then we also replaced a TX head in the back that had died. Now for the Hardware 6 CPU, luckily it's pretty plug and play. You can just unplug the old Hardware 4 one and put the Hardware 6 one in its place, reusing all of the same exact cabling. We also had to upgrade all of the regular heads, which was honestly kind of a bummer because it was still working perfectly fine. But the newest generations of heads are more sensitive, and the newer Hardware 6 CPU is not compatible with some of the older regular heads, and since I'm upgrading everything here, and the whole point is to have the latest and greatest of everything for testing and comparison purposes, we wound up removing all of the old regular heads and installing the new ones. And they were really careful when it comes to measuring everything out and then removing the old heads and putting the new ones in their place, especially because of the fact that we wanted to reuse the laser jamming housing in the rear, for example. And then as for the rear TX sensor, luckily the ALP does do a good job of letting you know if you have any sort of hardware failures or head failures, and so I wound up buying a replacement TX sensor and then just replacing the dead one with the new one. And then once all the wiring was done in the back, for example, they resealed the hole for all the different cables that's back behind the license plate. Next, we've got the upgrade to the TMG Alpha-17. This is basically upgrading from the A15, upgrading the CPU, the heads, and the the wiring. Now the CPU is very straightforward to upgrade. I don't actually keep the CPU permanently installed in the car, which I've explained in the previous video, kind of going over the final product and how it's all installed there. But one of the biggest things we upgraded was actually the cabling. It turns out the cables that go out of the back of the CPU, they're pretty thin and flimsy. In fact, we noticed some of the cables back there were starting to pull out and even break. And I think that this would actually explain the different issues that I've seen with the TMGs over the years. And so we wound up replacing all of the wiring there, and to help improve the durability of the TMG wiring, they actually reinforced the connectors for the new cables that are installed in the car now. Now, one thing that we didn't realize though, unfortunately at the time, is that TMG had also changed the connectors for the new heads. And so we wound up actually having to run a new cable through the firewall. The issue though is we didn't actually realize it until like towards the end of the install, when they'd already like closed everything up and sealed it. And so they wound up having to like reopen things and run a new cable for the new TMG connectors as well. So a bit of a bummer, but I guess that's just kind of par for the course, where when you're upgrading systems, sometimes there's new connectors to deal with. Next, let's take a look at the laser jammer clusters themselves, like the mounts that we've got there to hold these different laser jammers. Now, one of the things that I really like about this model year of Audi Q5 is the grille has these huge openings. It's actually one of the reasons why I bought the car. It makes it really nice when you're installing a bunch of different countermeasures for testing like this. Now, these laser jammer holders we wound up rebuilding. You see, the Escort laser jammers are now smaller than before. We wanted to add the Uniden jammers, which weren't there before. And then for the center heads, I used to have both an ALP TX and an ALP regular there, so I could test with both combinations. ALP is now recommending 2 regular and only 1 TX, and so we removed the regular head from the center, and that also helped make room for the Uniden head in the center as well. So we basically just had to redo all the different mounts for the laser jammers up front. Now, all these different mounts were first designed in CAD. I first laid out where I wanted the different laser jammer heads to go. Then they would design something in CAD and then laser print a mock-up that they could use to fit into the grill and see how well everything fit. And once they got a design that they liked, they built the different laser jammer holders to install in the grill. Additionally, they also made some laser head covers to help hide the heads and make the whole thing more stealth and hidden. And to create these head covers, they used smoked acrylic, which I noticed is a little bit lighter than the perspex that I've used in years past. Additionally, we've noticed that with my grill design, it's harder to build a head cover for the center mass heads, and so for that reason, this time around, they made the center head cover fixed, while the outer head covers, these ones are still removable. And to make them removable, they installed some little magnets into the mounts themselves, and then they also built these little extension bars that would connect between the head cover and the mount itself. These, of course, were totally custom as well. And then once they've got all that built, they installed it so that you've got the head covers and then the heads like this that are pressing right up against the back side of the covers, again, to minimize any sort of internal reflections with the heads firing behind those acrylic covers. The covers themselves are also designed to be angled with the contour of the car and flush with the grille. And then in testing, just like with the previous version of the head covers that I found that testing with the head covers on or off didn't make any difference in terms of jamming capabilities, which is very nice because in practice, I'm going to be driving with the head covers on. Next, moving on to dash cams, we went ahead and permanently installed the VFO A229 Pro. It's my favorite go-to dash cam. I really liked its video quality. I used to have the cables hanging down my dash for the power cable and the front to rear camera cable. Now we went ahead and tucked the cables up inside the headliner. And we did the same thing as well for the power cable too. It runs to one of the 5 batteries in the back of the car. I used to have the power cable installed in this like temporary connector for hardwiring dash cams underneath my armrest. Because I want to go ahead and have it installed permanently, we just wired it up to one of the batteries back there. And then like with all the other cables in the car, they wrapped the wiring with this protective tape just to make sure everything stays nice and safe when it's installed in the car. And then when it comes to the Blackview dash cams, I've still got the same 4-channel Blackview dash cam setup to record in all the different directions. And I like running it alongside the VFO. The VFO offers me better video quality, and the Blackview gives me the cloud capabilities. Plus, I've now got redundancy with 2 front and rear cameras. As a bonus, we also installed another hardwire cable from the front to the rear of the car just to make future expansion easier. Now, I noticed with the Blackview camera that's installed on my rear window, sometimes it would have issues getting a GPS lock and displaying a speed properly on the video footage while I'm driving. And so for that reason, I upgraded the LTE module that the rear cam is connected to. The newer version of the module has a GPS chip built in. It's kind of for dash cams that don't have GPS built in already. I'm not actually sure if it helps for dash cams that do have GPS, but just in case, we went ahead and upgraded the LTE module that's in the back of the car too and plugs into the rear camera. Now, Blackview's currently not still offering their firmware that allows one dash cam to connect to another, and so for that reason I've only got the cloud capabilities on the rear camera and one of the side cameras. Blackview, please release the upgraded firmware that you promised that allows other dash cams to connect so I can get cloud capabilities for the front camera as well and the other side camera. In the meantime, I do have now the Wi-Fi capability to connect my JBV1 phone, my Wi-Fi capable radar detectors, etc., but I definitely want the cloud capabilities for the front camera too, so I'm really hoping that Blackview goes ahead and releases that. Next, when it comes to the dash cam wiring, this was probably one of the biggest and I think most important upgrades. You see, I've been having some issues over the years with like being able to charge all of the batteries properly. It turns out one of the relays in the back was faulty, and if you take a look at the wiring back there, you can actually see that some of the wiring had actually burned out. Luckily though, it was only the wiring near the faulty relay, and so for that reason we wound up cutting off all of the affected wiring, replacing it with fresh new wiring, and then installing some replacement relays for both the radar detectors and for the dashcam battery packs, and they installed some bigger, beefier ones too while they were at it. Now as for the dashcam battery packs, I wasn't sure if we were going to be able to upgrade any of those just because it's already pretty full back there, but luckily we found that if you take the batteries and actually rotate them 90 degrees, it creates a little bit of room for some of the newer battery packs that are also larger than before. They've got larger capacity. And so for that reason, we were able to install a bigger, larger battery pack, the Blackview B130X, in place of the Cell-Link Neo. And because it uses the same wiring, it made the upgrade process a breeze. Now for the mounting, what they did there is after they rotated the batteries 90 degrees, they reused the existing straps, but the buckles of the straps would actually get in the way of allowing you to attach the other dashcam battery on top. So for that reason, they basically built a spacer that could go between the batteries. They installed double stick tape on the bottom and then some Velcro on the top, and this would basically space things out a little bit so then we can install the new battery pack up on top of the old ones and not get in the way of the buckles from those straps. And then as for a bunch of just cool stuff that I've seen for the install process itself, obviously we had a lot of equipment to install and new cables to run and whatnot, so one thing that they did to actually seal those cables is they used this special rubber called butyl. It's essentially a soft moldable rubber that you can wrap around the cables, and they would actually wrap it around all of the cables together, and then you wind up pulling this big bundle of cables into any openings to effectively seal those holes and avoid any sort of issues with water intrusion. And they did this trick for both the front and the rear cable runs. And then when it comes to avoiding rattles, that can definitely be a concern when you're adding all this aftermarket stuff to your car. I asked them about that, and they said that's definitely something that they pay attention to. For example, there's a lot of cars where they do sound deadening, and they wind up actually ripping up the cars way more than they did with my cars. And they even have this special acoustic foam that they installed to help with sound deadening. And while we didn't install any of this foam on my car, they said that there's a couple tricks that they do to avoid any sort of like rattles and stuff in the car. For example, they wind up building brackets for all the hardware that they install. They don't wind up using zip ties or anything just because there can be more vibrations if you're using zip ties. Additionally, when they're using zip ties to like tie up the cables or something, they also turn the zip tie so that the head of the zip tie doesn't actually press against any plastic paneling and create vibrations from the cable shaking as you're driving. They were also really careful about every single screw and clip that was removed in the car, making sure that they could track it and then reinstall it back into the car afterwards. They don't want to wind up having any maybe screws missing or clips not holding any panels in place, because that can also lead to vibrations as well. As for running the cables through the car, there was a cool trick that I saw that makes that process easier. That's definitely something that I've struggled with when I've done installs. Now, one trick, of course, is using snakes that allow you to run cables behind body panels or under the seats or something. And another trick that they do is when they attach the cables to the snakes and they wrap everything in electrical tape, they'll actually spray that whole bundle with glass cleaner to act as lube. And this is going to make it much easier to get the snake and wires through really tight places. Now, the reason they use something like glass cleaner is the fact that it dries completely dry. Unlike something like WD-40, that can actually stay behind in the areas where you run the cables, and it can actually get into the tape and the glue and actually start to loosen the glue around the tape, and so things don't actually hold well afterwards. Glass cleaner, when it dries, it completely goes away, and so you're not left with those issues the way you would if you ran something like WD-40, for example. Additionally, they also don't wrap all of the cable up with tape before they run it through any tight areas. They'll do some of it, of what's going to kind of go inside areas that are covered up, but they want to make sure that the cables are actually smaller and smoother before they get the tape. It makes it easier to pull it through, and then after they get the wires through, then they can go ahead and start to wrap the rest of everything with the protective tape. And then when it comes to double stick tape, they had a cool trick for that as well to help the double stick tape stick better. And if you take a look at this clip where they're building the mount for the Escort laser bridge box, if you take a look at the bottom of the bridge box, you can see just how shiny it is. And this is because they first clean all the different surfaces with acetone. And this is going to help to remove any sort of like dirt or grease or even any finger oils or anything That way the surfaces are nice and clean and the double stick tape can stick that much better. And then they also did the same thing on top of the bridge box, right where it connects with the Uniden laser distribution box. And then when it comes to cleaning glass, I asked about that because I've had issues with Windex leaving streaks behind, and they said they actually use the spray away cleaner. Incidentally, it's actually the same one that I've been switching to as well in place of Windex. It's available at Amazon or Costco, and I'll link to that in the video description as well, just like I do with all the different countermeasures that I talk about in this video too. There was also some cool things like cleaning and replaced rusted screws that were hard to remove. They can just clean that with WD-40. It was cool seeing their experience and expertise when it comes to pulling off the different body panels and doing so without breaking any clips, as well as how to then put everything back on without forcing or breaking anything. And so yeah, as you can see, there's definitely a lot that's involved here with these installs. And so as far as my final thoughts here with these installs, it was impressive. Like, it's one thing to drop your car off at a shop, right? And it comes back and you got all this cool stuff that's installed, but seeing what goes on behind the scenes, all the attention and care and level of detail and all the things that happen behind the scenes that you wouldn't see from the final product just looking at the outside, like, it turns out there's a lot that goes into that. It's not only how they pull off the panels and how they run the wires and stuff, but like, how can they do that kind of stuff safely? How do they make sure that there's no rattles or annoying vibrations that you hear in the car when you're driving? How do they ensure that in case maybe somebody needs to pull a bumper panel off in the future, whether it's for service or repairs or anything like that, how do they do it when they still make all the wires, serviceable, accessible, have the quick releases visible to other technicians in the future who've never seen your car before, making sure everything is labeled and accessible? Like, there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on behind the scenes that you wouldn't see just from the finished product on the outside, There's of course all the mounts that they build, some of which are internal for the CPUs or the speakers, some of which go in the cabin for your controllers and displays. Some of them are going to go into the grille for like the laser jammer housings, for example. You've got the removable acrylic covers that they can custom design for your grille and your specific laser jammer setup. And so there's a lot of stuff that I saw them do that's honestly well beyond my level of capability and expertise. In fact, while I was there at the shop, I even saw some other cars that had come in from other shops, not going to name names or anything, but like places where people had gone and they were like, hey, I'm really unhappy with the quality of the work that I got or the results that I'm seeing. And so they wound up actually having to like get all their equipment ripped out and then reinstalled at this shop. But either way, like, I've been pretty happy with this installer specifically. I've been to them now twice. They've done an excellent job both times. If you'd like a good quality install for your car as well, Systems Unlimited, Bellevue, Washington, again, that's where I went to here for this specific install. I'll drop the info in the video description for you as well. A big thank you to Systems Unlimited, and thanks to you guys for hanging out and watching this video here. Definitely stay tuned for more videos of testing the equipment, of reviews and comparisons and tutorials and all the good stuff that we do here. Having all this stuff installed is of course going to make it now way easier for me to keep doing more videos and better videos for you guys. And so with that said, thanks so much. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.